And what's going on, Los Angeles, LAFB fam, Bruin Nation, the Madman here on a very somber Sunday morning. My goodness, I was on last week and I said I can't believe I'm doing this podcast last week after the UNLV defeat, because never in my wildest dreams did I think the game against UNLV would have the outcome and the style that it did. And now we've reached a whole new level of despair here after last night's incomprehensible, unfathomable 35-10 loss at home to the University of New Mexico. I am stunned and without words for most of the night. I had a hard time sleeping last night. A lot of Bruin fans and friends and alums kind of reached out to me to sort of talk about the state of things with football, and I just couldn't bring myself to talk very much at all last night, given what I saw and what the circumstances were that led to this just incomprehensible performance against a very valiant University of New Mexico team, but a University of New Mexico team that had not beaten a Power 4 opponent since 2008. So 17 years since New Mexico defeated a Power 4 opponent, just to give you a sense of the discrepancy in terms of program from a perception perspective. And not only do they snap that streak, they do so in emphatic, dominant, dynamic fashion, beating the Bruins, who were 16.5-point favorites at one point in the week. The line was fluctuating between 15.5 and 16.5 points, and ultimately beat the Bruins by 25. And frankly, it could have been a lot worse, given some of the circumstances associated with University of New Mexico turnovers and getting stopped twice at the UCLA 3-yard line. Think about that. They had 35 points and got stopped twice inside the UCLA 3-yard line. So things could have been so much worse. I have a lot to kind of share and want to structure the conversation into kind of three parts. The first is, let's recap what happened last night and talk about, the stats and the circumstances and what have you. The second part of our conversation, I'd like to spend time on how we got here. How did we get here at this very moment in time, sitting at 0-3 in the 2025 season? And then I want to spend the last part of our conversation, friends, talking about where do we go from here and what's next. And so let's start with what happened last night. And this starts with a conversation at the line of scrimmage. In a game when you've got a Big Ten team or an SEC team playing a lesser team, the key barometer here is, how does the line of scrimmage move on both sides of the ball? Everything else is sort of an outcome from that. The score, the number of big plays, the amount of turnovers, the amount of sacks, all of those things are a function of how the line of scrimmage moves. And presumably, when you play teams like UNLV and New Mexico, as a team in the Big Ten, you would expect UCLA to be able to dominate the line of scrimmage, or at least be able to really enforce their will at the line of scrimmage, both from a run game perspective as well as from a pass game perspective on the offensive and the defensive sides of the ball. And granted, University of New Mexico came in, new team, really good coach, and UNLV, obviously with Dan Mullen, now a really good coach. But for where UCLA needs to go and is expected to go as a program in the Big Ten, you should be able to move the line of scrimmage at will offensively and do whatever you want. And on defense, you should be able to disrupt that line of scrimmage at will as well. And the exact opposite happened last night. University of New Mexico ran for 298 rushing yards on 46 carries. They averaged 6.5 yards per carry on 46 carries. And alternatively, UCLA on their side of the line of scrimmage ran the ball for 109 yards on 22 carries, which was a total misnomer because the Anton Woods run at the end of the first half, the very last play of the first half, was 33 yards. And University of New Mexico was in a total prevent expecting a Hail Mary. So if you take that 33-yard run away, UCLA last night ran for 66 yards on 21 carries. So UCLA was at 3 yards per carry rushing. University of New Mexico was at 6.5 yards per carry rushing. So New Mexico dominated UCLA on both lines. UCLA couldn't run the ball, and UCLA couldn't stop the run. And then when you factor in that from a pass rush perspective and a disruption perspective, UCLA had 0 sacks and 0 tackles for loss. This was a total annihilation at the line of scrimmage. And you saw it in terms of just the way the game was played and the flow. New Mexico sort of dominated this game right off the jump. Third consecutive game that UCLA fell behind by double digits. We saw it against Utah. We saw it against UNLV. And now here we go, see it again against New Mexico. So totally owned on the line of scrimmage, which is what is so disheartening. Because if you're getting owned on the line of scrimmage by the likes of a New Mexico, by the likes of a UNLV, really up-and-coming, scrappy programs, excited for them and where they're going, how on earth are you going to be even credible against the likes of Penn State, Ohio State, USC, Michigan State, and all of the teams that are coming on this particular schedule? So that was alarming factor number one. Number two, again, the question of discipline and penalties. UCLA, 13 penalties for 116 yards last night. There was no message received. DeShaun Foster talked about penalties being his number one focus over the course of the week. Seems like the message was completely lost there because this was a team that looked as undisciplined as ever, and to the tune of 13 penalties for 116 yards. And then when you factor in just the puzzling time management over the course of this game, particularly at the end of the first half, and then some of the choices there at the beginning of the second half, you really just wonder, where is the plan? Where is the system? A lot of folks on the Big Ten Network were sort of alluding to UCLA just needs to play within a system, within a plan. It's very obvious there isn't a system. There isn't a plan. And what was most puzzling last night with 2 minutes to go, University of New Mexico had a 4th and 1 at the UCLA 4. And UCLA let New Mexico just burn 40 seconds off the clock. So now from a minute 55, you're down to a minute 15. So even if you get a stop, even if you don't get a stop, you just let 40 seconds burn off the clock, which could have been 40 more seconds for you to get that score back or to score in a 2-minute situation at the end of the first half. They let New Mexico burn the 40 seconds, ultimately get the stop. And then it was a very puzzling set of choices of when to use timeouts, when not to use timeouts. We ultimately got to 4 seconds left in the first half. And rather than let Nico air it out, sort of a quick throw to Habermill for 5 yards, and that needed to be reviewed. There was still a second left on the clock. And then you get into presumably Hail Mary territory. Then, oh, by the way, you get a false start. You get pushed back 5 yards. But then instead of just chucking one up, you end up with that run to Woods, which was sort of a fluke run there because everyone was expecting the Hail Mary and fell 20 yards short. So absolutely bizarre there. And then when you talk about that first drive out of the third quarter, after the team has been with the coaching staff, opportunity to sort of course correct here, 3 and out on 3 straight incompletions, and then on the punt, you get a penalty. So you go incompletion, penalty as the way you want to start that second half. So between the penalties, the time management, and the lack of juice, I'll use a DeShaun Foster terminology because he said, I'm looking for the juice tonight. The lack of juice, both at the start of the game as well as the start of the second half, was incomprehensible. And then I thought in the second half, Nico started pressing a little bit. And you saw that particularly with that first drive in the third quarter. But even when New Mexico had their back-to-back fumbles, because middle of the third quarter, New Mexico comes back up 14-7. At the end of the first half, they got stopped at the 3-yard line. They drive it all the way back midway through the third quarter. They get stopped again on 4th and 1, and the ball gets fumbled. UCLA, on the subsequent drive, goes 3 and out there. They have to punt, and New Mexico muffs the punt. You feel like there's a lot of momentum. This is the moment now UCLA can get back in the game. New Mexico has led UCLA to come back into the game, and even that one throw to Matthews that kind of set up the Bagani 51-yard field goal, that was also behind him. And Matthews made a terrific play for 28 yards to kind of get into field goal range. And then you saw more penalties and more lack of flow to get that field goal. And then later in the game, as it got to 21-10 and then beyond, you saw Nico taking more and more chances. You just felt like he was pressing. He felt the weight of the world. And obviously it was a tough game at times for Nico. But yet again, there's just a lack of support that he has on both sides of the trenches, both sides of the line of scrimmage. You can't help but wonder, how much longer can he take of this, both sort of physically and mentally moving forward, sitting at 0-3. And I have grave concerns about Nico Iamaleava being a UCLA Bruin beyond the 2025 season, because knowing his team, knowing his camp, they can't be pleased at all with where this is going, and probably want their star pupil to be in a situation where he can thrive a little bit more. So that's a conversation for later. But Nico pressing, I thought, was the third element to this game. So how we got here, let's sort of put this one to bed. 35-10 loss. Look, we have a head coach right now, folks, and I just love him as a person. I want to see him succeed so badly. He bleeds UCLA. I think the blueprint here is to be the second coming of Terry Donahue, someone with a 20-25-year run, who's an alum, who understands the intimacy of what it means to be a UCLA Bruin, and really sort of help thrive and cultivate Bruin Nation back to where it was in the 80s and 90s. But it is very apparent right now, 15 games into his tenure, that DeShaun Foster is in over his head. I think when you look at the combination of three performances here, the two demolitions at home, and then the first half demolition against UNLV, the way this team has gotten to 0-3 is what is so alarming. And the regression from year one to year two really shows that DeShaun sort of inherited some positive things, particularly on that fearsome foursome with the defensive front. But year two is a year you need the arrow to be going up. Year two is not the year where the arrow is significantly cratering, and that's what we're seeing right now. I think DeShaun, he's a running backs coach, never had a day of experience as a coordinator. I think he's just in over his head. I think the messages about discipline, about enthusiasm, about respect, all noble pillars, by no question about it, but this message is just not being received. UCLA is getting dominated on both sides of the line of scrimmage to lesser opponents. And at this stage, the outlook for this season is very bleak. We talked about how New Mexico was the only team remaining on the schedule coming into last night from a football power index perspective in ESPN FPI that UCLA was favored to win. And so we're moving forward here with a situation of a very dire outlook, and I'll get to that in a second. But we have a head coach here who went from running backs coach to the head coach, and you're just seeing, just in terms of, I think schematically, I think in terms of in-game adjustments, I think in terms of sort of just poise with the media, I think all of it, all aspects right now, with the exception of recruiting, he seems to be completely in over his head. And so that's sort of an unfortunate predicament that we're in. Number two is, and I mentioned this before, it's undeniable when you lose 8 guys to the NFL over the last 2 years in the front seven, which is the most important unit in the Big Ten. Your ability to control the line of scrimmage defensively, to be able to stop the run and disrupt the passing game with the front seven, is what is most paramount in the Big Ten. And the fact that you lost Leatu Latu, you lost Femi Oladipo, you lost Madrano, you lost Toia, then you lost Leatu Latu, you lost Darius Moasau, you lost the Murphy twins. To lose 8 guys over the last 2 years to the NFL, you just can't reload that quickly at a place like UCLA right now. Maybe if you're Georgia, maybe if you're LSU, maybe if you're Michigan or Ohio State or Texas, you have the program humming and scaling at a specific level where you can replace that talent, but there is going to be a drop-off after those 2 years. So you got a head coach who's in over his head. You got to replace talent. So it's a subpar year from a talent perspective, particularly at the line of scrimmages. And then I think number 3, the cupboard was bare a little bit from a recruiting perspective. And this is most of these points, I'll be honest with you, are not actually on DeShaun. I mean, DeShaun getting the job isn't on DeShaun. DeShaun losing 8 guys to the NFL over the last 2 years isn't on DeShaun. And then I think the circumstances of the cupboard being bare, frankly, isn't on DeShaun either, because, the circumstances by which Chip Kelly ultimately left UCLA, rather than a decision being made by athletic director Martin Jarman in December of 23 and letting that spill over into 24 in February. DeShaun inherited a situation in 24 where he didn't have time to recruit. And so he's only had one recruiting class here in 25, but the focus of that recruiting class has been on the subsequent year. And so we knew the history of Chip Kelly not wanting to recruit. But here's where it gets interesting. Chip's deficiencies as a recruiter are well known and are not defensible in any way, shape, or form. But he knew how to pick guys in the transfer portal. And so where Chip got it completely wrong was he wasn't a pitcher. He didn't pitch players, but he was a picker. He knew how to pick players. And when you think about the Zach Charbonnets, when you think about the Leatu Latus, when you think about the Jake Bobos, when you think about all the guys we talked about on defense just now, those were all guys that Chip Kelly picked in the transfer portal. And I think that's where item 3 comes in. Not having that refined eye of DeShaun Foster and company. Now, not only is the cupboard bare from a recruiting standpoint over the last few years, but this past year and the past couple of years, you weren't able to pick and go 10 out of 10 on the picks in the transfer portal. When you think about a guy like Collins Acheampong last year, or you think about Nico DeVilliers this year, guys that you were hoping were really going to step up and play big roles, and it never came to fruition. So you're in a situation with a head coach over his head. You've lost talent, and this was always going to be a year where the talent needed to sort of ramp back up. And then number 3, with the cupboard bare and not hitting on the transfer portal the way this team has been able to in years past, outside obviously of Nico Iamaleava, the confluence of those 3 things has led us exactly to where we are. And so, friends, that takes us to where do we go from here? And I had alluded to it. I said I didn't want to go there over the course of the week, but a loss to New Mexico in the fashion that has happened, we are sitting at the low point of UCLA football in my lifetime. Certainly, my first memory of UCLA football was Wayne Cook's season taking the team to the Rose Bowl, so the 93-94 season. So my memories and my love for UCLA goes back over 30 years. And in that 30-year period, to me, this is the low point of UCLA football. I compared it to the other low point was kind of the 50-0 loss to USC, the emotions associated with Rick Neuheisel being forced to sort of play the Pac-12 championship game because SC was on sanctions, and then ultimately Neuheisel being released. And you could tell how much UCLA meant to him and still means to him. But that feeling of despair left fairly quickly with the hiring of Jim Mora and the excitement that was to come there. We are at a point here at 0-3. This far surpasses that when you talk about fan sentiment, you talk about the crowd situation last night, reportedly at 31,000. I think those were some inflationary numbers there. And just the outlook. It's one thing to start an 0-2 season when you're playing a couple powers. It's one thing to be 1-5 last year when you've got a murderer's row schedule of 4 straight opponents. But to be 0-3 to start this season and be outscored 108-43 when you've got the likes of non-Power 4 schools, 2 of the 3 guys on the schedule are non-Power 4 schools. I mean, how do you sort of recover from that? And the sad thing is 0-12 at this point is a very real possibility. UCLA is not going to be favored in any game the rest of the season at this point. And so, we are at the low point of UCLA football in my lifetime, and I'm sick to my stomach about it. And I think the question now is what happens? And, some conversation about DeShaun Foster's buyout and, what the circumstances there are. DeShaun Foster has signed a 5-year, $15 million contract, rough numbers there. There's some escalations at the end of every year, but roughly $15 million over 5 years. He's in year 2 of that. And what's written in the contract is if he is let go and relieved of his duties post December 1st, then the buyout is only 60% of the remaining amount. So this is year 2. At the end of year 2, he would get $6 million, obviously over the 2 years of the 15. So there's $9 million remaining. 60% of $9 million is $5.4 million. So a very manageable $5.4 million buyout. But we'll see what happens here moving forward. How does Martin Jarman respond? I personally, just me as an individual, I have a hard time believing DeShaun would be let go in season. I think that you're at least going to sort of let this season play out because you're already a quarter of the way through. And, even sort of putting someone in an interim capacity, maybe a Tino Sunseri or whatnot, I think it's, you've got to figure this thing out regardless. You might as well let DeShaun try and figure it out himself. And then it makes the buyout slightly more manageable. But where does DeShaun Foster go from here, and where does Martin Jarman go from here from a decision standpoint? Even though I'd be surprised by it, it certainly would be a very justifiable decision if Martin decided to move on from DeShaun within the next few days. Just this is how dire the product on the field has been. And then the other wild card in all this is our great beloved new Chancellor Julio Frank, who by all indications is just been decorated and so well received across the university. I've had a chance to meet him personally. Just can't say enough incredible things about him and the things that he's going to do for this university over the next several years with the medical school, with technology, with all the research. I mean, just phenomenal. But how much does Chancellor Frank want to get involved here and look at this situation being about 6 to 8 months on the job? Does he want to look at DeShaun Foster's performance? Does he want to look at DeShaun Foster and Martin Jarman's performance collectively right now? Does he want to let Martin Jarman kind of handle this and let Martin Jarman sort of work this out and potentially kind of lead the next hire and then step in and then sort of assess the athletic department holistically? I think all of that remains to be seen in a fascinating way. From a program perspective, the bye week, I think, couldn't have come at a better time. And there's, I think, going to be an opportunity here to make some adjustments. And don't be surprised, fans, if perhaps there's some staff changes, perhaps there's some changes in terms of approaches, personnel, coaches, perhaps even sort of administration associated with the football program. So it's going to be a really fascinating next couple of days of how the powers that be want to sort of handle moving this forward. But when you think about fan sentiment, when you think about the product on the field, and when you think about what's to come here moving forward, just a really painful day last night at the Rose Bowl. And we just hope that brighter days are ahead. But we have hit the low point in my lifetime of UCLA football. And hopefully this is a moment where Coach Foster, Martin Jarman, UCLA administration decides, okay, perhaps this is an inflection point that we have to decide what exactly does football mean to UCLA, to the alumni, to the university ecosystem, and to our future, and to how much is UCLA a part of the strategic plan of UCLA moving forward to really assess it, because this is unsustainable moving forward as a product. And so fans, please, hit that like and subscribe button. We need your support now more than always. Will and I and Wayne and everyone at LAFB Network just loves doing this so much, and we just need to keep building the community. And I know it's so hard under these circumstances to build a community, but we're trying to build this community and provide the very best UCLA coverage that we possibly can, because we bleed UCLA. And keep your heads up, folks. Take a deep breath, maybe take a step back from things for the next few days. There is a bye week, and if any movement happens, any stories drop, anything that's breaking, we know we always got your back at LAFB here. So as I always say, and I'll never relent from that, no matter what, no matter 13-0 or 0-13, no matter 16-0 or 0-16, no matter the greatest team in the history of college football or the worst team in the history of college football, I will never relent from saying, be loud, be proud, be passionate, Bruins. And as always, fours up forever.